My name is Cole Mercer, and the day I realized an entire neighborhood thought they owned my lake was the day I stopped being invisible. The funny thing is, I never set out to fight anybody. I wasn't some rich landowner looking for a legal battle, and I definitely wasn't the kind of guy who enjoyed conflict. I ran a small diesel repair shop just outside Briar's Cove, a wealthy lakeside community that had spent years pretending I didn't exist. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee from a chipped mug, grease under my fingernails before sunrise, and a slow drive past fields that had belonged to my family longer than most of those lakefront houses had existed. The only thing my grandfather ever left me was a parcel of land surrounding a quiet, natural lake tucked behind the neighborhood. No trust fund, no stock portfolio, just land. Back when he owned it, the area was mostly woods and cattle pasture. Then developers arrived, roads appeared, luxury homes followed, and suddenly a bunch of people with expensive boats found themselves living next to a lake they didn't own. That part always seemed to bother them. I didn't think much about it for years. The lake sat there peacefully. People admired it from their back porches. Kids occasionally tried fishing from the shoreline. Life moved on. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I remember it clearly because I was already in a bad mood. One of my mechanics had called in sick, a customer was angry about a transmission repair, and I hadn't slept much the night before. I drove out to check the eastern shoreline after hearing construction noise all weekend. At first, I thought maybe someone was repairing a dock on their own property. Then I walked over a small rise and stopped dead in my tracks. There was fresh concrete spread across part of the lakebed. Massive steel supports had been drilled into the ground. Workers were installing polished wooden decking that stretched farther into the water than anything I'd ever seen there before. It looked less like a dock and more like a private marina. What really caught my attention wasn't the construction itself. It was the sign bolted near the entrance. Residents only. Private lake access. I stood there staring at it for a solid minute, wondering if I was somehow losing my mind. The structure sat directly on land that belonged to me. Not disputed land. Not shared land. Mine. I actually laughed at first because it felt too ridiculous to be real. Then one of the workers walked over and asked if I needed something. I said, "Yeah, actually, who approved this?" He shrugged and pointed toward the neighborhood. HOA project. Just like that. HOA project. Like those 3 words magically overrode property records. I drove home without saying another word because I already knew arguing with construction crews wouldn't solve anything. That evening, I pulled old filing boxes from a closet. My grandfather had saved everything. Survey maps, deeds, easement agreements, engineering reports, yellow documents older than I was. I spent hours at my kitchen table reading every page. Around midnight, I found exactly what I was looking for. Not only did the lake belong to my property parcel, but the water management rights belonged to me as well. Decades earlier, my grandfather had installed a controlled spillway system at the north end. Most people didn't even know it existed. It regulated seasonal water levels and protected surrounding land from flooding. More importantly, the entire system sat inside my property boundary. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the paperwork for a long time. That's when I started understanding what had happened. The Homeowners Association had spent years acting like the lake was community property because nobody challenged them. New residents arrived. Old residents moved away. Assumptions became facts. Somewhere along the line, they convinced themselves that because they could see the lake, they somehow owned it. What bothered me most wasn't the dock. It wasn't even the trespassing. It was the arrogance. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody sent a letter. Nobody asked permission. They simply decided my silence meant surrender. The next afternoon, I received my first visitor. His name was Gregory Shaw, president of the Homeowners Association. Perfect haircut, perfect smile, perfect golf club handshake. He showed up wearing loafers that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. "Cole," he said warmly, "I hear there's been some confusion regarding the marina project." Confusion. I almost laughed. I invited him onto the porch and brought out copies of the survey maps. His smile faded about 30 seconds into the conversation. "This can't be correct," he muttered. "Actually," I said, "it is." He studied the papers again. "Well, The community has already invested substantial resources into this project. I nodded. That sounds expensive. He looked at me like he expected sympathy. Instead, he got silence. After a moment, he leaned forward. Surely we can work something out. That phrase stayed with me. Work something out. Funny how people suddenly want compromise after they've already taken what they wanted. When he finally left, I sat alone on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The lake reflected orange light across the water, calm and beautiful like it always had. That's when I made my decision. No shouting, no social media arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just action. Early the next morning, I walked through the woods to the old spillway control. Rust covered portions of the mechanism, but it still worked exactly as designed. My grandfather used to bring me there as a kid and explain how every system has a control point. Every machine, every engine, every piece of equipment. If you understand the control point, you understand the system. Standing there with one hand on that old steel wheel, I realized the lake wasn't controlled by the people living around it. It wasn't controlled by lawyers or homeowners meetings. It was controlled right here. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip, and slowly began turning the valve closed. The first day, nobody noticed. At least, not publicly. The lake was large enough that a slight drop in water level looked like nothing more than a hot week in early summer. I went to work, rebuilt 2 injector pumps, argued with the supplier over a delayed shipment, and came home without giving the situation much thought. But the next morning, I saw the first signs. A narrow strip of muddy shoreline had appeared near the marina project. Nothing dramatic, just enough to expose a few inches of ground that had been underwater before. By the third day, people were paying attention. Residents walking their dogs stopped along the shoreline and pointed. Boat owners started posting photos in the neighborhood Facebook group. Questions appeared. Nobody had answers. I stayed quiet. Another 2 days passed, and the lake dropped even farther. What had once looked like a luxury marina now looked slightly awkward, like somebody had built a tuxedo in the middle of a construction site. The expensive decking remained, but the water beneath it was retreating fast. I remember standing on a hill overlooking the lake one evening and thinking how strange arrogance looks when reality finally catches up with it. The structure hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. The facts had simply become visible. That's when the phone call started. First came Gregory, then 2 HOA board members, then an attorney named Randall Pierce. Every conversation followed the same pattern. They began polite. They ended frustrated. Randall called me on a Thursday afternoon. "Mr. Mercer, I'm representing Briar's Cove Community Association." "Congratulations," I said. There was a pause. "We'd like to discuss the unusual decline in lake levels." "Would you?" Another pause. Longer this time. "We believe your actions may be causing unnecessary harm to community property values." I almost dropped the phone laughing. Community property values. Not community property. Not legal ownership. Property values. Finally, someone was being honest. "Mr. Pierce," I replied, "if someone built a marina in your backyard without permission, would you call that unnecessary harm?" He didn't answer. Lawyers rarely answer questions they don't like. Instead, he shifted into legal language, mentioning potential claims, damages investigations, and several other expensive-sounding words. When he finished, I simply asked, "Did your clients obtain written permission before pouring concrete on my land?" Silence. "Then, I'll have to review that matter." "You do that," I said and hung up. By the end of the second week, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Water levels had fallen enough that the steel supports beneath the marina were fully exposed. Boats could no longer reach the slips. The shoreline looked different every morning. Cracks appeared in areas that had been submerged for years. Residents gathered in small groups near the water's edge, watching the transformation like spectators at a slow-motion accident. One Saturday, I stopped by a diner outside town and overheard 2 people discussing me at the counter. They didn't recognize me. One woman said I was selfish. Another claimed I was holding the neighborhood hostage. The old man sitting beside them shook his head and said, maybe they shouldn't have built on somebody else's land. That was the first time I realized public opinion was beginning to split. For years, everyone had assumed the HOA represented the community. Now, people were discovering the story wasn't quite that simple. About 3 weeks after I closed the valve, Gregory returned. This time he didn't arrive smiling. He looked tired, stressed. The confidence was gone. We sat across from each other on my porch again, but it felt like an entirely different conversation. "What do you want?" he finally asked. It was the first honest question anybody had asked since this started. "I want my property restored. That's all." I nodded. "Remove the marina. Remove every support beam. Remove every inch of concrete. Restore the shoreline. Cover environmental remediation costs. Then we're done." Gregory stared at me. "You're serious?" "I've been serious the whole time." He rubbed his temples. "Do you have any idea what that's going to cost?" "Probably less than building it twice." That answer seemed to hit harder than any threat could have. He left shortly afterward, and for the first time I thought maybe this would end peacefully. I was wrong. The following week things became ugly. Anonymous complaints appeared against my repair shop. County inspectors suddenly showed up. Someone reported imaginary zoning violations. One customer told me he'd been warned not to do business with me. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. The HOA couldn't beat the facts, so they tried making my life difficult instead. For a while, I won't lie, it got under my skin. There were nights when I sat awake wondering if it was worth it. My business mattered. My reputation mattered. Maybe I should compromise. Maybe I should let them keep part of the structure. Maybe fighting wasn't worth the stress. Then one evening, I drove out to the lake and saw something that settled the question forever. An elderly man was sitting on a folding chair near the shoreline. I recognized him immediately. Walter Briggs. He'd lived in the area longer than almost anyone. He waved me over. "Quite a mess, huh?" he said. I sat beside him. "You could say that." Walter looked out toward the stranded marina. "Your grandfather would have enjoyed this." I laughed. "Probably." He nodded. "You know why people respected him? Because he was stubborn?" Walter grinned. "Partly. But mostly because he understood that if you let people take an inch, they eventually convince themselves they own the whole field." We sat there quietly for a while. Then he added something I'll never forget. "The lake isn't really what this fight is about." I looked over at him. No, it's about whether rules apply equally. Rich people hate finding out they don't." That conversation stayed with me. A few days later, everything changed. Randall Pierce called again, except this time his tone was completely different. No threats, no pressure, no legal theater, just facts. "Mr. Mercer, after extensive review, my clients would like to discuss settlement options." Settlement options. Funny phrase. It usually means one side just discovered they're losing. We met in a conference room downtown. HOA representatives filled one side of the table. Their attorneys sat beside them. I brought a folder and a cup of coffee. That was it. The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. Engineers presented reports. Surveyors explained property boundaries. Environmental consultants described restoration requirements. By the end, every argument the HOA had relied on collapsed under documentation. The marina had been built without authorization. The concrete work violated multiple regulations. The land belonged to me. The water rights belonged to me. The spillway belonged to me. There was no loophole. No hidden technicality. Just ownership. Real ownership. The kind recorded in legal documents older than most of the houses surrounding the lake. Around the final hour, Gregory looked across the table and asked quietly, "If we agree to remove everything, you'll restore the water level?" I took a sip of coffee before answering. The day restoration is complete. Nobody argued. Nobody threatened lawsuits. Nobody demanded concessions. For the first time since this entire mess began, everyone in the room understood exactly where things stood. 3 days later, heavy equipment arrived at the shoreline. Excavators rolled across the exposed lakebed. Demolition crews unloaded tools. Residents gathered in large numbers, watching from sidewalks and balconies. The marina project that had taken months to build was about to come apart piece by piece. I stood at a distance with my hands in my pockets as the first section of concrete cracked under hydraulic hammers. The sound echoed across the empty basin like thunder. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. it wasn't that kind of victory. It felt more like reality reasserting itself after a long period of pretending. Every broken slab exposed another mistake. Every removed beam erased another assumption. And as the structure slowly disappeared, I couldn't help wondering whether the people watching understood what had really happened, because the marina wasn't the only thing being torn down. An entire sense of entitlement was collapsing with it, and for some people, that was probably harder to accept than losing a dock. Over the next several days, the marina disappeared faster than I expected. Once demolition began, there was no dramatic last stand, no surprise court order, no miraculous loophole that saved the project. Reality is usually less cinematic than people think. Most of the time, when the facts are finally settled, the ending becomes unavoidable. Still, standing there watching those machines work, I couldn't help feeling something I hadn't expected. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. If anything, it felt like relief. For months, maybe years, everyone involved had been operating inside a story they told themselves. The HOA believed the lake belonged to the community because they wanted it to. The residents believed the marina was justified because nobody had challenged it. And maybe I shared some responsibility too, because I'd spent years keeping to myself, letting assumptions grow unchecked. Silence has a funny way of becoming permission in other people's minds. By the end of the week, the last concrete slab was hauled away. The steel supports were gone. The shoreline had been graded and restored. Environmental crews finished repairing damaged sections of the lakebed. Looking across the basin, you could barely tell anything had ever been there. The giant project that once seemed permanent had vanished almost completely. Late that afternoon, I drove out to the spillway alone. No reporters, no attorneys, no HOA board members. Just me and the same old control my grandfather had shown me when I was a kid. I stood there for a long time before touching it. The air was quiet except for birds moving through the trees. Part of me thought about leaving things exactly as they were. Not forever, maybe, but a little longer. Long enough to make sure everyone remembered. Long enough to enjoy the lesson. But that's the thing about anger. If you hold on to it too long, eventually it starts controlling you instead of the other way around. My grandfather used to say that winning isn't making the other guy suffer. Winning is deciding when you're finished fighting. So I wrapped my hands around the wheel and slowly turned the valve open. At first, nothing happened. Then came the distant sound of moving water. A low rush carried through the pipes and channels feeding the lake. Within hours, shallow areas began filling again. Over the following days, the water returned steadily, spreading across the basin, covering the cracks, softening the scars left behind by months of conflict. Watching the lake refill was strangely emotional. It felt less like fixing damage and more like restoring balance. Nature doesn't care about homeowners associations, property disputes, or expensive legal battles. Water simply follows its path. A few weeks later, life started returning to normal. My repair shop stayed busy. Customers who had disappeared came back. The county inspections stopped. The anonymous complaints vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. Apparently, people lose interest in harassment once they realize they're on the losing side. As for Gregory, I saw him once after everything ended. We crossed paths at a gas station outside town. Neither of us expected the encounter. He nodded first. "Morning, Cole." "Morning." For a moment, we just stood there awkwardly. Then he surprised me. For what it's worth, we should have asked. I studied him for a second, trying to decide whether he actually meant it. Eventually, I nodded. "Yeah, you should have." He gave a small laugh. Not because it was funny, but because there wasn't much else to say. Then he got back into his SUV and drove away. That was the last conversation we ever had. The lake is still there today. On calm evenings, the water reflects the houses around it, just like it always did. Kids still fish along certain sections. Residents still walk their dogs near the shoreline. From a distance, you'd never know any of this happened. But the people who live through it know. Every now and then I notice someone looking across the water toward the far corner where the spillway sits hidden among the trees. They know it's there now. They know who controls it. More importantly, they understand something they didn't understand before. Ownership isn't determined by popularity. It isn't determined by money, neighborhood status, or how many people agree with you at a board meeting. Ownership is ownership. Boundaries are boundaries. And respect should come before construction equipment. Sometimes people ask whether I regret how far things went. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wishes the entire conflict could have been avoided with a simple conversation. A knock on the door, a handshake, basic respect. Another part of me knows that some lessons only stick when they become expensive. Maybe if I'd backed down, the marina would have stayed. Maybe next year, they would have expanded it. Maybe 10 years later, nobody would have remembered the truth at all. That's the part that still makes me think. Not the doc, not the lawyers, not even the money. The assumption, the belief that enough confidence can somehow replace permission. Maybe that's why this story still follows me. Because it wasn't really about a lake. It was about a line. One side believed the line didn't matter. The other side knew it did. And eventually reality decided the argument. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have shut off the water and forced them to remove everything? Or would you have found another way to handle it? And if you live in that neighborhood, would you blame the HOA? Or would you blame me for letting the lake drain until they had no choice? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. Some call it justice. Others call it revenge. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves real-world property disputes, neighborhood drama, and those rare moments when actions speak louder than words. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the valve.